But before I get to that, let me change gears a little bit and take a longer term perspective on China's economic performance. Xi Jinping, since he became president in 2012, has talked much about the Chinese dream of the rejuvenation, as he calls it, of the Chinese nation. And what, in economic terms at least, this means is returning China to the preeminent position it has had in the world for most of human history. The next couple of charts I'm going to show are drawn from the work of the late Angus Maddison, who was a statistician at the OECD for many years, and whose life work was backcasting estimates of GDP as far as it was possible to do using the very limited range of information in most countries back to that period. But to the extent that you can infer anything from the historical material, what this chart shows is that throughout most of human history, at least up until around the middle of the 19th century, China and India, which have always had the world's biggest populations, also had the world's biggest economies. And it wasn't until the 19th century, but particularly from the middle of the 19th century until the middle of the 20th century, which China officially refers to as the century of China's national humiliation, when, although China wasn't colonized fully by Western powers in the way that India, for example, as well as many other Asian, African countries were, colonized by Western colonial powers. But during that period, China's significance in the world economy fell to levels less than many quite small by comparison European countries. Of course, this chart also makes clear that the deterioration in China's position began before foreign countries began making incursions into China's territory. It's in part the result of decisions by the Ming emperors to disengage from the world economy, particularly after Zheng He's voyages of discovery. And of course, the deterioration in China's relative position continued after the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, basically all through Mao's period as ruler of China and until Deng Xiaoping's reforms started in the late 1970s and early 1980s. This chart shows per capita GDP of various countries relative to the average for the world as a whole. And again, it makes clear that from 1 AD, the beginning of the Common Era, until about 1800, China's per capita incomes were higher than those of the world as a whole, not as high as, for example, Italy's had been at the time of the Roman Empire, or Britain's had been during Britain's reign as top nation between about 1700 and 1900. But clearly, as you can see, China and India fell well below world norms during the 19th and 20th centuries, while the UK and then the United States became the world's richest and most powerful nations. It's also perhaps worth noting now that by the current period, China's per capita GDP is almost back to the global average, although of course it's well behind those of more advanced economies in Europe and North America. Most people are, I think, aware of China's achievement in almost completely eliminating extreme poverty as defined by the World Bank since Deng Xiaoping began his opening up reforms in the late 1970s. In 1980, almost 90% of China's population had to survive on the equivalent of less than $1.90 per day, expressed in 2011 prices, which is the World Bank's definition or benchmark of extreme poverty. And by the time Xi Jinping became president of China, that proportion had been reduced to less than 2%. And since 2016, it's been effectively zero. And China has done substantially better in that regard than a whole raft of other emerging and developing economies, as you can see on the right-hand side. And this is often highlighted both by the Chinese Communist Party and by others, whether they're friends or not friends of China's rulers, as acknowledging a very significant achievement in terms of improving people's living standards over the last 40 years. What's perhaps less widely recognized is that while China's done a great job in reducing the proportion of its population who live on less than $1.90 US a day, which, as I've noted in a footnote before, is the equivalent of just over 40 Australian dollars a week. When you define poverty slightly less strictly, China's experience doesn't look so good, especially in comparison with other developing economies. So, for example, the proportion of China's population that still lives on less than $5 US a day in 2011 prices, which is equivalent to about $42 a week, that's still 20%. Or if you like, 60% of China's population today still lives on less than $10 US a day. Or even more so, about 90% of China's population lives on less than $20 US a day, which is equivalent to about 425 Australian dollars a week in today's values. And that's about $100 a week below the official Henderson poverty line for a single person in Australia. And if we compare those slightly less demanding benchmarks for China with other countries, you can see that whereas, as before, China was one of the very few emerging or developing economies that had reduced the proportion of its population living on less than $1.90 US a day virtually to zero. When we talk about less severe, but nonetheless still pretty onerous levels of poverty, China's performance in reducing poverty is at best middling. And there are plenty of other countries operating under a range of different political systems, some authoritarian, some very democratic, that have done better than China at reducing other measures of poverty than China itself has done. It's also worth noting that in the process of reducing extreme poverty, China has become a surprisingly unequal country for one that officially proclaims its adherence to communist doctrines. The Gini coefficient, which is a widely used measure of income inequality, more than doubled between the early 1980s and the global financial crisis of about 12 years ago. It's declined a bit since then, as you can see from the chart on the left, but by comparison with other countries, both advanced and developing countries, China is still a pretty unequal country when it comes to income distribution. Or if you want to put it a different way, bringing these 3 or 4 charts together, a disproportionate share of the fruits of China's undoubtedly impressive economic growth over the last 40 years have accrued to people at the top of the income distribution in China, in many ways to not much less an extent than in the United States, where that's much more widely recognized than it is when it comes to China. Some of this may be part of why China's rhetoric regarding its development strategies is undergoing some important changes. The Chinese Communist Party is very conscious of its history, and it often expresses its goals, its ambitions in terms of, in an historical sense. So in 2017, President Xi laid out what he described as 2 centenary goals. The first of those, which was to be achieved by the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Communist Party of China, which was in 1921, so that anniversary is this year, was what he called the building of a moderately prosperous socialist society in all respects. The second goal, which is, he said, to be achieved by the centenary of the foundation of the PRC, that is in 2049, is for China to have become a great modern socialist country. And that goal was to be achieved in 2 distinct phases, Xi said. The first of those phases, which he called a new development phase, was to be completed by 2035. And in that, China will seek to become, among other things, a global leader in innovation, a much stronger cultural soft power, and you can see evidence of this in the way China's used mass surveillance and devised social credit scores for each of its 1.4 billion people, significantly enhancing as he put it, the social etiquette and civility of its people. As I say, those goals are meant to be achieved within 14 years from this year. And then the second stage of this centenary goal is to have China become a global leader in total national strength and international influence, and to have reached new heights in every dimension of material, political, cultural, ethical, social, and ecological development by 2049. In a speech on the 11th of January this year, Xi Jinping officially proclaimed that China had entered this new development phase. And he used an interesting delineation of China's post-1949 history to amplify what he meant. He said that during this phase, the Communist Party will be leading the people to usher in an historic leap from standing up, which is CCP code for the Mao era from 1949, when in proclaiming the establishment of the People's Republic, Mao said from the top of Tiananmen Square, or from the Gate of Heavenly Peace, that the Chinese people had stood up, to the era of getting rich, which is a nod to Deng Xiaoping's assertion that to get rich is glorious. That was the period between 1980 and roughly today, to now the period which Xi Jinping says China will be becoming strong. And in order to achieve the goals of the first phase, the new development strategy, as Xi Jinping calls it, he's also unfurled over the past 12 months something which has come to be known as China's dual circulation strategy. This was first promulgated at a Politburo meeting in May last year, and was then fleshed out in more detail at the end of the 5th plenum of the Communist Party at the end of October. And officially, the two key elements of this dual circulation strategy are, first, international circulation. That is, China is not officially shutting the door on the outside world, but rather will further open up by, for example, pursuing trade agreements with other countries and reducing barriers to foreign investment in areas where China welcomes foreign investment. But the more critical one is domestic, or so-called internal circulation, in which, according to Xi, China will unleash the full potential of its domestic demand, improving connectivity between the domestic and international markets, and better using resources and both domestic and international markets to propel stronger and sustainable development. Well, that's the official form of words. What does it mean in practice? Well, it seems to be about three things in particular. First, reducing reliance on imports of high-tech products, in particular, semiconductors and chips being foremost on those, energy and food, two things of particular importance to Australia, and instead encouraging domestic production of those items. Second, it's about reducing reliance on exports and Chinese investment overseas as a driver of growth. The first of those has been part of China's strategy for quite some time. The second represents something of a break with a key element of Xi Jinping's Belt and Road strategy. And third, dual circulation is about redirecting the flow of both equity and debt finance away from property development towards, in particular, advanced manufacturing. Almost certainly, dual circulation is a defensive response to the deterioration in the global environment as China's leaders see it, following the anti-China strategy pursued by the Trump administration, and, as I'll show in a moment, the generally less sympathetic attitude towards China of many countries, both within China's immediate region and across the world as a whole. As I say, it's particularly a response to the bipartisan push within the United States to decouple from China in particular technology, but also in other areas like education. And it also seems to convey second thoughts about the Belt and Road program, both within China itself and among some of the recipient countries that perhaps haven't been as grateful for the large amounts of Chinese investment they have received as China thinks they ought to be. Which kind of leads into my third subject, which is China's relationship with the rest of the world.